Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're again speaking once again about Ottoman history, but today we're going to be speaking about these major structural transformations that were occurring in the Middle East, starting around the 1580s and continuing through the 1600s, that forced the empire to adapt and transform in many numerous ways and change the old order, and that has been interpreted as decline by some Ottoman observers and many modern historians. Now we're going to look at some of that ideas, but before we do, we need to think in general about decline. So let me ask you a question. Is the USA today in decline? Just try to come up with a yes or no answer very quickly. But if you do think so, what do you think are its symptoms? What would you say? Would it, growing inequality? Would it be about military power, the capacity of the country to project power across national borders, to be an international standard, etc.? What aspects are actually in decline? And if you think that it's actually in decline, what do you think is the classical age? Would it be the 1950s and 60s? Would it be the 1990s and 2000s? When do you think is that golden age in which decline started afterwards? Now, if you can't decide or you don't have any ideas, that's actually pretty common because ideas about decline have been constantly brewing for many years, and in fact they're the basis of one current presidential candidate and president who wants to make America again great again. So the idea that America's in decline and can be revived is on the minds of many people, and it's been that way since 2019 when these articles were pulled up, but also of course in the 90s. And of course, if you want to go further back, there's always someone who thinks that America is not the way it used to be and it's falling apart. And in fact, I want to keep this in mind, keep this idea that in a sense decline is a subjective experience, and it's also a normative claim, right? It's an idea about how a society should be and how it should change in the future, okay? Now, let's think more broadly about this in the Middle East. So of course, all societies and states, they face challenges over time, right? Growing population, changes in political culture, economic insecurity, whatever. And these essentially force it to adapt or to collapse. We don't know how long the United States will be around for. Maybe we'll be around for another 300 years, but in whatever case that it will be around, it will look radically different than what it is today, just like it was radically different from today than what it used to be 250 years ago. So this is, of course, common sense. Now, the Ottoman Empire also undertook, had basically major structural challenges that almost forced it to collapse in the 1600s. And in fact, if we look around the world, there is actually a giant political crisis in which many major states had dynastic collapses, overthrows of kings, etc. But let's not get into that right now. I just want to focus on some of these challenges. Some of these challenges are also causes, etc., and responses, but let's look at them. This includes population growth. Because of the kind of Pax Ottomana, right, the general sense of security that had developed as the Ottomans had taken over a very large area and basically stopped war and allowed trade and security to take root there. All of a sudden, these places became just much more stable, and people actually, under especially good climatic conditions, were able to produce much more food. The population essentially doubled in Anatolia and possibly in parts of the Balkans. Now, so that period was that 16th century period was the kind of what's seen as a global warm period, a medieval warm period. But in the following centuries, starting in the 1590s, the climate started to get ever so slightly colder. not very much, by half a degree on average Celsius. But it actually resulted in massive failures of harvests over many years, and ultimately, in many parts of the world, a massive collapse of population. So those are climactic problems that the Ottoman Empire had to face at this time. On top of this, so on top of the shortage of food, while having a growing population, there was also the fact that more and more of the population had become Muslim, right? So in the early years, not that much of the population was Muslim, but by 1600, large portions of it had converted, or more Muslims were being born. But if you remember, they had a system in which the elite, the people running the empire, the people in charge and actually profiting from this system of government, were actually recruited through slavery. And so that meant that freeborn Muslims weren't able to enter the government. They weren't able to enter this space. And so there was actually pressure to expand the political class and allow freeborn Muslims to enter the various bureaus of government and the military, especially the janissaries. The fourth thing, I think, is at the same time is that while initially campaigns were very short, lasting maybe a season, in the 1300s and 1400s, the Ottomans had these massive successes. They quickly, went from conquering Bulgaria to conquering Kosovo to Serbia, etc. But afterwards, you have these long drawn-out wars, 10, 20 years that it takes to do an Iranian campaign. And then at the same time, because of, as we'll see, these wars, you have persistent rural banditry, which leads to depopulation of these areas and growth of urban centers. And then ultimately, as well, unconnected to this, but there's a transformation of who the janissaries are and who is the military, and that they actually become involved in a set of popular protests that lead to the overthrow of the Sultan. So these are some of the, actually in multiple times between 1622 and 1730. So these are some of the major structural challenges that forced the Ottoman Empire had to confront at that time. So the adaptations that were undertaken to do this, to respond to these, were many, and I can't get into it, but I just want to mention some of them because those are going to be the focus of the following lectures. So one is just the idea that the elite had to expand, this askari class, this military class, which didn't pay taxes, and that basically took the profits of the empire. It had to grow, and it grew exponentially. This basically took the form of expanding the number of janissaries, which went from a few thousand during the early period of Suleiman or the early period of Mehmed II, to hundreds of thousands of people by the 1600s. At the same time, there was complaints about women rulers, about the invasion of power of people like the Queen Mother or the chief concubine. Other people like the chief jurist, different preachers, everyone started sticking their hands into politics, which they probably had done before, but this time it was seen as a bad development in the nature of the polity. And that's because power was increasingly being distributed to these people, and that the Sultan was increasingly a sort of figurehead as all these different factions and new groups of power holders competed and worked with each other to run the empire. And the third thing is that they allowed kind of ultimately freeborn Muslims to enter these different aspects of the government, right? So the janissaries and the bureaucracy and the government, which had initially often been closed to freeborn Muslims, now became primarily staffed by freeborn Muslims who were entering through apprenticeships and connections, etc. The same way we enter into jobs today. So the other major adaptations, which we'll talk about, they started kind of outsourcing tax collection what's called tax farming. They debased their currency to pay for larger armies. They moved away from this conquest model, which had kind of sustained the empire until the 1550s, because it just became harder and harder to conquer new territories. The previous distribution of spoils wasn't working. They needed to essentially shift to a new bureaucratic mode of government. And all of this was going on. There was also, more and more different forms of public culture and public debate and protest occurring. This happened in coffee houses, theaters, and festivals, but also through things like public preaching and morality movements at that time. Now, some Ottoman observers, not all, but some, saw these changes, and they basically said that, okay, something's wrong. This isn't like the way it used to be. And therefore, the empire is in decline, and we should go back to the principles of the classical order, which they often saw as the period of Sultan Suleiman. But what I want just to ask is, who claimed this decline? Who were they, and what problems do they see? And more importantly, not to take these complaints literally, as modern historians have. Because if you take them literally, that means you start saying that basically Ottoman Empire was in some sort of permanent decline starting in the 1580s that lasted for another 350 years, which doesn't make any sense, because ultimately the empire continued, albeit with less military success, but it continued very well. People were alive and prospering, and it continued to adopt and transform over these next centuries. So keep that also in mind, of course, when you see any claims about decline in America. And in fact, their decline is a sort of discourse, right? It's a type of way of speaking and thinking that allows us to organize our thoughts to achieve different political ends. So things about to think about decline is that, ultimately it's a normative claim. It's a way of thinking about how we should act. When you say something is in decline, you have an idea of, well, there is some golden age, right? What I have here is number 2, that we should go back to, and that the way we're acting now is not correct, is wrong, and therefore we need to change it. We need to radically reorder society to achieve these ends. Now, whether or not they can actually do that reordering or not depends on the different capacities of the people and the state, etc. But there is this idea, and of course it goes back to this. It assumes, for example, that a society is like some sort of biological organism, right? That has a youth, a prime of its life, and then a senescence, and therefore it has to go through these different phases, and maybe with proper structure it can return that. But societies aren't organisms. They don't actually follow these forms necessarily. There's no cycle here. So keep this in mind, because now we're going to look at some of these Ottoman statements, complaints about the changes, and we'll keep in mind how they understood what was going on. So the first one is this figure, Lutfi Pasha. He was a retired Grand Vizier. He wrote the book called Asaf Name. Asaf was the vizier or advisor to Suleiman, the prophet Suleiman, or the biblical Suleiman, who was regarded as very wise. Asaf, his advisor, was helping him make all the great decisions that made him a model of government. Therefore, this is why Lutfi Pasha, the retired Grand Vizier, writes a book called the Asaf Name. Now, this is 1541, so it's still in the reign of Suleiman, but he's already complaining now, right? He's saying, there's corruption, cost of living is going up too much because of price fixing, and this is that people are not promoted by merit, and he said the Navy should be further developed, but the standing paid army should give it 15,000 people. Okay, so he's already saying the army is too big, the janissaries who receive a wage, etc., is too large. We need to make it smaller. Now, fast forward 90 years, and we have a figure named Kochibe who had a similar position. And so he basically says, in some ways he repeats some of the same things, but it has a different tone to it. He complains that the Sultan is no longer present, right? He's not visible anymore. He's not actively involved in the affairs of the state like he probably used to be. And this is because all sorts of different people, that is women and eunuchs, that is the queen mother and eunuchs, chief eunuchs, are now involved in the politics, and other people like the Janissaries themselves, who he complains are full of Turks, Gypsies, and Jews. And because of that, he can't be an effective Grand Vizier. And they complain the treasury is empty, that taxes are being collected by tax farmers, that people aren't being appointed by merit but by favor, etc. So we have actually many of these kind of same things, and if you put them together like chronologically, it seems like, and you take these people seriously, as you have in one of the primary sources that we're reading from actually about a century after Kochibei, it seems like there's just constant problems and they don't change. But this is just a way of making an argument to reorganize the state. And we see this, for example, also in Kiatab Chalabi, by the way. Kiatab Chalabi is an amazing figure. He was actually a minor bureaucrat in the army, like his dad. And he kind of educated himself in all sorts of, basically a self-educated man in many ways. And he set out also to explain some of the problems with the empire. One of the things he points out is that there's just a massive increase in people in the army, right? So we go from 41,000 to 48,000 to 91,000 by 1609, and the amount being paid is obviously increasing, also beyond the actual amount here. And he said under, Osman II, Mustafa I, basically at 1618, the number of troops is rising above 100,000 men. Then he says, then people tried to clear it, etc. It got back to 59,000 at 263 million aspers, but then it kept raising. So no matter how much they tried to cut down the army, the numbers kept going up, and they couldn't keep it down to the limits of Suleiman, nor could they keep these costs down. So what you get is some sort of basic, what's clear is from these figures that he was giving from the army as a bureaucrat is that, expenditures were overcoming the actual income, right? And every year between in these periods that he's giving, they were spending more than they actually had. Now, other people complained not about the fact that, the treasury was empty, or women were involved in politics, but they complained about the moral character of people, right? So we can also say this about, maybe America today, that the morality of people has changed, right? That they're too partisan. People aren't nice to each other anymore. There's something wrong with them. They're on their phones, etc., etc. And so this anonymous judge named Vasey said kind of around the beginning of the 17th century, he said, this is his complaint. He said, the law of God is disregarded. Religious people are all hypocrites. Judges are corrupt. Women and young boys make all the decisions. Everyone is only interested in making money. Cavalry and sipahis are neglected, not given fiefs. Janissaries cause disorder. Higher officials are corrupt and tyrannical. So what you have here is a combination of moral and administrative changes, right? And this is constantly bubbling up. And in any of these cases, the idea is, of course, to try to go back to some original golden age and to change the life at that moment. But when was this classical age? For these people, their vision of the classical age was the age of Suleiman. Now, it wasn't really like that, because even during the age of Suleiman, people were complaining like Lutfi Pasha. And even then, it wasn't in any way close to being the same. It was a much smaller empire, a simpler empire, without the same amount of people, without the same complex structure and world. But in their mind, they had created the age of Suleiman as this classical period where everything was perfect, and therefore that's when they had to return to. And part of that is because many of these people writing these works, people like Kochibey or Lutfi Pasha, were themselves the products of the Devshirme or Penchik, right? They were raised in the palace, they developed in it, and they didn't like the new people coming in, and they complained about these changes and these transformations. And so for them, they saw this old order that they were part of going away, and they complained about the rise of the new order.